Hey everyone, this is Ben Umstead.
And this is Martin Perkins.
So, we've got some really exciting news to share with you all. The audio book for Language of the Soul, A Path of Simplicity, is now available not only on all the major platforms like Audible, Spotify, Apple Books, it's also on Martin's website, martinperkins.com. So you can buy that directly from Martin and support him and support me as well, since I am narrating the audiobook. There's also some super cool stuff happening this summer. It's the 2024 summer series at Simplicity Farm, where Martin does the Language of the Soul courses.
On July 14th from 8:30 to 11 a.m., you can be in person or via Zoom. It's a free introduction to Tao Yin. A way of looking at what Tao Yin is, it's the foundational practice behind the healing and growth that most folks in seeking out language of the soul, they are seeking healing and growth in their lives in some way. It connects you to the ancient practice of deeply resting and deeply connecting to the soulful part of who you are in your life.
Another really great way of engaging with healing and growth is through the enjoyment of stories. And so we're going to do a movie club this summer. We're going to do 3 films. The first film is Arrival. You can watch that in person with Martin on July 21st. And then there's going to be a discussion on July 25th over Zoom. You can also watch the movie in your own time and join a discussion on the 25th. The second film is going to be Inside Out, the first film, not the sequel. You can watch that with Martin in person on August 4th. The discussion is going to happen on August 8th. The third and final film for this movie club this summer is Three Colors Blue, and that viewing will be on August 25th, with a discussion happening on August 29th.
Transitioning into the last event of the summer series at Simplicity, there's going to be on September 22nd from 8:30 to noon, a forest bathing experience. That day will begin with a meditation as well as an orientation to the spaces here at Simplicity, and then obviously the time in the forest, and we'll ultimately gather at the end in the healing center here at Simplicity.
If you'd like to sign up for any of these offerings, go to martinperkins.com. On any of the pages, you can scroll all the way down and you'll see a mailing list sign up. That's where you're going to get the newsletter. That's where you're going to get updates on these offerings and everything happening at Simplicity Farm. And now, on to the episode. Welcome back to the Language of the Soul podcast. Conversations on healing and growth is the name of the game, including healing and growth for trucks, as my neighbor pulls out down below in the parking lot. I'm Ben Umstead. With me, as always, is
Martin Perkins.
Martin. You and I have been talking a lot about, pondering a lot about, and getting down into the written word via the newsletter for healing and growth on this idea of the on-off switch in our culture. What do you mean by the on-off switch?
So there's this understanding that we're either vigilantly doing things in our lives or we're passively doing nothing. And it's a kind of delineation that I think most people see as necessary in order to be productive. And it's frankly, from my perspective, led to or been a contributing factor in a kind of collapse into exhaustion that I see over and over again in students, clients, and the world in general. And it's a kind of view of the world where there's very little consideration of our health and or well-being.
So is this up notion to be productive is to be in high gear, like you use, these particular words that I really like. They're the passive state and then this really cued in just full force. It seems to me like this doesn't really serve anyone. Like, it doesn't really address how we rest. In learning how to turn that on off switch off, or rather learning how to let it go, what what have you found to fill that void with? Because it is a pattern that we're talking about, and when you let go of something, you do need to fill that space, nourish that space with something. So what does that start to look like? What does that paradigm shift look like in reality?
Well, it's interesting because if we look at it from the perspective of what are people doing to fill that void or fill that space, when people who aren't comfortable with the push, push, go, go of life, what do they do? Well, my experience is that we see a lot of people with addictions.
Hmm.
So chronic usage of drugs, alcohol, weed, I notice, is a really significant way that I see people attempting to be relaxed, to be at ease. And it frankly doesn't work because it takes us out of presence.
Right.
And so what do I see in the world at large? I see largely people using ways to check out of their lives so that they can be at ease, they can be relaxed. My experience in my own life, having left that addictive pattern long ago, is a practice that largely focuses on being an observer to my own experience through a practice in meditation, to bring a practice in presence to the forefront, to bring ease and relaxation into the forefront so that it becomes the focus rather than the focus being solely on how productive I am.
You bring up the observer, which is such a potent word. It's a powerful descriptor. For those not familiar with this practice of the observer, with this embodiment of the observer, what is that like? Bringing it into meditation, bringing it into ease. What are people going to feel in that presence? Because I think it is about presence, but it's a very particular kind of presence, as if I know I can speak to it as being just tuned into a deep wisdom, soulful self that is kind of always floating in this calmness. It doesn't really have an agenda.
Certainly that's a facet of it. A simpler way of even before one feels that depth of wisdom, one feels more attunement with what's going on in one's body, right?
Right.
The patterns of tension that might ultimately lead to body pain, headaches, sinus conditions, all of those things through the cultivation of the observer get caught earlier and earlier to the point where we catch ourselves before the headache begins, before the shoulders lock up our necks. We begin to catch ourselves at the earliest points of tension, and we have tools through a practice in meditation, just the simple act of consciously breathing shifts that pattern.
It's really feeling into what those patterns are. softening them. So this is an incredibly important part of learning to let go of this on-off switch. What are some other facets of that letting go that you've come to experience in your life and experience as a teacher with others on this journey?
Well, one of the kind of odd yet significant linkages to the pattern is that procrastination becomes something that largely is born of the pattern. And when we let go of the on off switch, procrastination, in essence, begins to fall away. Procrastination is often born of this lack of ease, this lack of joy in what we're doing. So we put off what we're not enjoying. We put it off because it feels tense, it feels hard to do because it's not feeding us. So procrastination is this thing that largely begins to fall away as we let go of the on off switch.
I can certainly relate to that procrastination part significantly, and just feeling that the task that I'm pushing back to the last possible moment doesn't feel, it feels intrusive, it feels disruptive. It doesn't feel, like you note, like it's a joyful thing or an embodied thing. Continuing to push it away and keep it as some kind of separate a nuisance or obstruction, obstacle, continues that pattern I've found, over time, and letting go and recognizing the significance of every choice that I make, even in things that may feel challenging to me,
Right.
getting, for instance, a new doctor recently, a new primary care physician, and feeling how there was that pattern of anticipating that I wasn't going to be heard, that I wasn't going to be able to communicate in a way where my voice was empowered. That makes me feel like I want to do all that stuff at the last minute. I want to put it off until my body is just asking for a change in a change in myself and a change in the world at large. I find the on off switch to be such a potent phrasing of all of this because it plays into every aspect of our lives. It's not just about the productivity that we may feel like that we have to be clued in on and doing at a school setting or a work setting, but even making dinner or doing things around the house to be productive versus being lazy is language that's often used in our culture. So here the language changes.
Right. Right. That's so important, what you're just getting to, that lazy moniker that people assign to the notion of being rested, right?
Hmm.
Like, you just you point so beautifully at that, because that moniker, that negative label of, if one is rested, if one isn't pushing, focused on being productive over everything else, one is often seen as being lazy. And it's quite the opposite, frankly, that if you allow yourself to be relaxed, to be well rested, there's, and you give yourself permission to focus on how you're doing life rather than getting so much done, or how much done can I get, right? Then the focus, the joy, and the productivity come along with it. And it's really becomes less about what you're doing and more about enjoying everything that you're doing, right? It becomes more about, oh, well, I enjoy these things, but not these things. Well, we're always going to, like, enjoy certain things more than others, but that doesn't mean that we have to preclude those from our lives in ways that creates such an ineffective approach to living, right? So,
Right.
it doesn't really have to be that when we hear those narratives, either coming from our internal dialogue or from others, to breathe and to recognize that that projection, more often than not, is somewhere along the way, it became something that we took on, and quite unnecessarily. And it is quite necessary to grieve that notion that we're lazy, because I really don't believe that there are really lazy people in the world. I think that there are people that aren't motivated. I think that there are people that are fixated and or held within due to the anxiety, the worry, the frustrations that are controlling their lives.
Yeah, there's this sense of discontent that can come up probably in the sense of letting go of something like this. Fear of losing productivity, but it really is a paradigm shift as we've been parsing through all of these touchstones. It's this paradigm shift into all of that's still there. All of what matters, how you're doing it, ends up being the focus. And I think that's so lovely. There's a softening there. And I think that's what really is at the core of how you frame healing and growth and what kinds of experiences and conversations come up, in the classroom. I can speak as a student where it is this softening and it is this vulnerability that doesn't mean that the quiet voice that maybe is the wounded child, let's say, because that can be a big one for a lot of people, that part of themselves that feels small and desperate and hidden away and quiet. It's not quiet. It's actually very, very loud. It's because it's very much driven by anxiety. All of this ends up softening. And through that softening, I feel like there's a flexibility, there's a power that everyone finds as an individual. It's a very unique experience, but in putting it through this lens of the on-off switch, letting go of the on-off switch, we don't actually lose at anything at all. I think this is often the cultural construct that can probably instill fear in someone of going, what would happen if I let that go? What would happen?
Right. And often what it really comes down to is, who am I if I'm not operating in this anxious or worried way? If I don't hold this resentment against something that feels repressive in my life, then who am I?
Hmm.
And as you put it, beginning to soften, to ease, to relax, and to let go of that with practice, with a great deal of practice, let go of that harsh inner narrative that says these habitual patterns define me. And slowly but surely, through practice, they fall away. But it's slow, and it's a very not slow, it's gradual. And what I mean by gradual is, sure, anything can happen in an instant. However, we're really talking about layers and layers of self. So while we might have an epiphany or a great awareness, there still requires a great deal of practice so that it becomes embodied.
And that's a really wonderful distinction to make. I feel like for a lot of people stepping into a daily practice, there's something so significant about knowing that these are inner narratives, that they're their own narratives. A lot of the voices that can take those fields, those roles of self-judgment, of negative talk, have their origins in others. They can be a parent, they can be an authority figure, a boss, for instance, at work, these kinds of things. But they're actually not those people at all. They really are just these voices within ourselves, different aspects of ourselves that needed, at one point in time, needed that pattern to work. And maybe it was only once, and maybe it was a year. And it doesn't fit into the moment. And I think that's the significant thing here. Breathing into the moment is that softening, is that grieving, is that letting go of something specifically like the on-off switch. And more broadly speaking, when you touch upon anxiety, worry, depression, sadness, in a chronic sense, in that being that this has to be the only way that we can live. That's the only story that that we can live in or that we've written for ourselves. I know that's been such a significant shift for me, thinking that, emphasis on thinking, not feeling, but thinking that that's the suffering that I'm supposed to be.
Right, right. And so one of the things that I do in the written version of the conversation we're having around the on-off switch, and in the essay, the blog that I share on my website, on social media, I in essence ask some questions at the end, which is, what's your version of this on-off switch? How is it reflected in what we're talking about here and what's shared in the essay? And how does your story differ? Because none of these stories are how are we've experienced it, you and I, Ben, may not be exactly how another experiences it. What emotions come up with this pattern for you, and is it about the part of you that's like feeling intensely, or like kind of this need of like, if I'm not intensely on, then I'm not living, or you know, if I don't fall into that like exhaustive pattern of just switching off, then who am I? Right. And these notions of who we think we are all really crucial questions that come up in the work I share with my students and my clients. And as well, like, what's the inner voice? Who's speaking when you get quiet, when you get really quiet? And what is that voice seeking to tell you about this pattern? These are all the kinds of questions that I would encourage folks who are listening to inquire within themselves through, say, a 10-minute meditation and then a 20 to 30-minute journaling time.
And I think that's something, when we think about productivity, when we think about being on and off and how much time we have for such and such, how we compartmentalize, looking at it in those steps are big leaps. We often talk about baby steps turning out to be leaps, and taking that 10 minutes and taking that 20 minutes to write. That's time that you would watch an episode of a TV show or sit and read or take a walk. And all of those things are actually really quite lovely and restful in their own right. It's breathing and getting quiet that I think all of this gets down to is is that voice telling you right now in this moment? What do you need in that way?
Right. And it really comes back round to what you shared at the very beginning, Ben, when you shared the notion of where you go when you focus your attention inward, and you spoke of a soulful wisdom. Well, that's the access point, right? You know, a byproduct of long-term connection with the observer and a willingness to connect deeply with who you are taps you into your own wisdom, right? And it is literally like a tap. Like, you know what I mean? You're something grows within you as a result of tapping this into your inner soil and letting it grow.
And that's the beautiful thing about this. These metaphors and these images and personal experiences that we're sharing, like you noted, are what you and I have felt. And I know that when I talk about the observer, it's as this non-judgmental voice, a voice that doesn't have shame, a voice that is very nourishing, compassionate, and loving. It's going to appear differently to everyone. And I think this is the wonderful experience of it. The on-off idea and a lot of the things that come up in healing and growth when we talk about how our society is structured feels like we're very much caught in binaries and in duality. It's this or it's this. And I think the irony of something like Tao Yin, the irony of looking at yin and yang and those different energies, is that they're not separate. They have distinct elements that are constantly intermingling. And this is what we talk about, you and I at least, in the holistic sense. So I get this sense of the on-off switch. It's really about letting that language go. It's really about letting that paradigm shift come in and never losing productivity, but actually, like you've talked about, making choices from a present state.
And keeping it as simple as possible through the lens, you know, many of my students aren't coming to me with this conversation about yin or yang or Dao Yin. They're really coming to me because they're tired of being anxious every day. They're tired of being tired. They know there's something else. And with practice, and that's why I designed the Language of the Soul course as a year-long course that you renew each year. And some people work with me for a year, and some people work with me for many years. And it's really about people's ticket in the door is often about something that feels very immediate for them. And then over time, they come to recognize that why they're working with me is because they've known all their lives there's this deep call
Mm.
to know themselves so much more deeply than they realized.
That speaks to the unfolding, which is something that we can talk about in great detail on another episode of the podcast.
Absolutely.
Well, it's wonderful to get a sense of all of the ways that we can look at healing and growth. There's really no one right way or wrong way to do any of this as long as we're engaged to the present and taking those moments to breathe and practice into awareness.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Martin.